Gender, a binary system no longer, both the opening line to my research proposal and a sentence to sum up the contentious nature of this issue. Answering the question, how do representations of gender norms in the media impact the prevalence and acceptance of gender diverse identities in Western society, was a challenging topic to investigate as it's based largely on opinions, many of which are unfortunately rooted in transphobia. Doing the background research for this project involved going through some gender diverse media which relied heavily on stereotypes and reading articles from more conservative backgrounds, all of which left me feeling disappointed and uncomfortable by how far people will go to stunt the happiness of others. And I think that speaks to our central theme of social justice. I found an interesting case in the media. Both the films Boys Don't Cry and The Danish Girl featured the tagline, "Find the courage to be yourself," which I simply cannot imagine being a coincidence, being that both these films have pioneered transgender representation in film. This simple tagline embodies the core of these films, painting how it is challenging and requires tenacity to be different and outside the binary, but is a right everyone deserves. However, it also begs the question, are these two films, released 16 years apart, telling the same story? And are the gender diverse representations we are consuming effectively illustrating the vast tapestry of the trans experience? This is a topic of interest to me as I'm always striving to create safe and inclusive spaces. With friends of gender diverse backgrounds and being in the queer community, it is always my priority to maintain educated about LGBT+ issues and causes. I also have an interest in gender studies more generally, so this project was an opportunity to further my knowledge in that field as well. When selecting what sources to use, I started with my own knowledge of gender diverse media. Shows such as Euphoria and TikTok content by Dylan Mulvaney immediately came to mind. Each a very different representation of gender identity, the character of Jules being much more established in her transition, while Dylan documented the early stages of her transition in her Days of Girlhood series. This then took me in a few different directions where I looked at articles and books that focused on broadcast media or film and TV and digital media, namely social media platforms. The most challenging aspect of this research process was definitely narrowing down my focus and pinpointing what aspects of gender diverse media were measurable for a year-long study. This led me to utilising existing media more as background and instead focusing on anecdotal evidence from gender diverse participants and how they are influenced by media representation. My focus definitely shifted throughout this process, making the project less about identifying media representations of gender and how these have shifted within the past 10 to 20 years, and more about analysing how media generally impacts prevalence and acceptance of gender identities. The proposed study was an independent groups design where participants would give qualitative responses to different survey questions to investigate the correlation between representation of gender in the media and the prevalence of gender diverse identities. It was proposed that the surveys from both samples would be collected to examine the perception and experience of gender norms. This research process was ultimately really enjoyable as it involved consuming an array of diverse media and reading numerous articles discussing the implications of gender representation, but it was also really challenging and confrontational. Although I ultimately labelled this research low risk, it was still quite upsetting to realise the obstacles we need to overcome to achieve social justice for gender rights. I think if I were to approach this proposal again, I would gather more insight from the people around me, including friends who use they/them pronouns or are gender fluid, to give my research more authenticity and witness what I was consuming through broadcast and digital media in reality. This research highlights both implications for transgender and non-binary people and society at large. Without media representation, gender diverse identities would not be where they are today. But this does not support the argument that media representation influences or makes people trans. The increase in gender diverse identities is instead a snapshot of a greater societal shift, one where gender roles and boundaries are pushed outside of the binary. Nonetheless, gender-diverse media is not where it needs to be, with tragic narratives becoming a dominant trope overshadowing more diverse and positive portrayals. Exclusivity in terms of what trans representation looks like, often featuring pre-transition or post-transition, but rarely do films or TV shows contain characters who are in the middle of their transition, or is this seen on digital broadcast? There's also limitations on transgender youth and their appearances in the media, as well as token characters being filtered through shows without any actual consideration for the characters themselves. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed my research proposal. Yes? What would you like to say? What would you like to add? Yes. I see. She agrees. We're in agreement. That's slay. My Uber Eats is